Welcome back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast, and happy to have David Anderson back to help preview Rutgers-Indiana and the keys to victory for this Saturday. A huge opportunity for Rutgers to become bowl eligible with a win against the Hoosiers, a team they've beaten 2 years in a row. David, thanks so much for being back. Wanted to get your initial thoughts on the quarterback situation for Indiana, which is a little bit up in the air going into Saturday.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. As always, we're running into another opponent with a quarterback controversy, it seems. In the case of Indiana, I'll try to give some context that Rutgers fans can relate to. So basically, you have Brendan Sorsby, who makes really good decisions, but he doesn't really have enough of an arm to fit the ball in tight windows. So he's a willing and able runner. The best way to think of him is a Giovanni Ricchino. He can run. He's tough. He's very good at reading defenses and making the proper read. But sometimes his proper read, he just knows he can't get the ball into that spot, and so he hesitates doing it. His completion percentage is kind of in the low 50s, just like Ricchino's was, even in the year that Rutgers won 3 Big Ten games. So I feel like that's a pretty good comparison. And then the other one is Taven Jackson, who is a high, profile recruit, big guy, strong guy, got a big arm, very live arm, hates to leave the pocket, and he has very poor decision making, in the words of their commentators. And you can see that in his touchdown to interception ratio, but you can also see it on film. He'll have plays where he's got 3 guys running around wide open and he'll force the ball to the guy that's covered. But because of his arm talent, he can still complete those balls to the receivers that we'll get to in a second. So it's kind of like you could see an opportunity if either quarterback plays that they could give Rutgers trouble. Either if they have a good set of plays for Sorsby, that he's not going to make mistakes and they can get the ball to their playmakers, or if Jackson trying to just throws the ball into tight windows into his receivers. Like, you could see either one of them having success, but neither of them has put together anything close to a full game so far this season.
That's a good summary in terms of both of them. It's interesting too because Jackson, he has like a 61% completion percentage, but 5 interceptions to just 2 touchdowns starting every game. And one interesting thing that Allen said, head coach Tom Allen, was that whoever they decide to go to, they're going to stick with the rest of the way. Obviously, they just fired Walt Bell as offensive coordinator prior to the Michigan game, and now they appointed Rod Carey, former Temple coach, who Shiano talked about a little bit this week. I guess how much do you think that will go into it in terms of you were mentioning offline, that they showed some different looks in the Michigan game at the start versus prior to. How much do you think maybe they will be able to kind of add as a wrinkle this week as well?
So there's basically 2 main differences from what I gathered watching the film and hearing the very little content that I could find on Indiana so far this week, which is, one, Jalen Lucas, who is their wide receiver, running back, just overall playmaker. He goes everywhere. Teams were keying off of him a lot early in the season, and Walt Bell never really wanted to use him as a decoy. So early in the Michigan game, Michigan was kind of flowing with him if he went in motion, for example, and then there were opportunities for one-on-one matchups on the opposite side. So once Michigan kind of adjusted a little bit to that, Indiana didn't have as much success, but it did seem to be working. And for whatever reason, Bell was just so adamant to get him the ball and never really kind of use that as a trick in any way. And then the second is that Bell liked to run a lot of triple option, which doesn't work particularly well when Jackson's in the game because he does not like to run. And when they were saying triple option, that could be 2 different backs, for example, Lucas in motion, and then one of their more traditional backs, like Henderson or Turner, like kind of in a dive, and then Jackson either throwing or running. It didn't seem to work because of A, he doesn't like to run, and B, he is not good at making decisions, whether they be handing the ball off, timing, or whether he should throw versus run. Whereas Sorsby had a little bit more success with it, but teams were not respecting, like they were just crashing down because they didn't respect a deep ball. So it does seem like Rod Carey just kind of threw that in the trash last week. We'll see if he brings it back this week, but It seemed like that was something that was also not effective early in the year. That being said, almost all the other things between Rod Carey and Walt Bell are pretty similar in terms of their track record. They use a small subset of plays. And so what you'll find is that if the other team's defense is a little bit worn down, Indiana, with their improved offensive line, is able to kind of just move people out, much like we saw Rutgers do to Michigan State at the end of the game last week when Michigan State was gassed, because they're so buttoned up in terms of the exact these core running plays, especially that they run, that they're going to take it to you. But if the defense has a little bit of fire and a little bit of ability to shove them off the line, then sometimes those plays get broken down. So he does have a small set of plays that he likes to go to. Maybe they're going to be slightly different than Walt Bell, but it is something where if they have success early in the game with a certain play, they'll probably go back to it. The thing that was the last straw for Walt Bell was there was a play against Maryland, I believe it was, where they gave the ball to Jalen Lucas. It was the same exact play on first down, second down, and third down. And so they were on third and short, but by third down, Maryland was like, there's no way they're going to run this play again, and then they just destroyed it in the backfield.
Oh, my
and so
goodness.
fans were fed up at that point, and they felt like that was kind of the last straw. So I don't think Carey will be as stubborn, but if a play does work, he will definitely go back to it, maybe just not 3 times in a row.
Yeah, that's wild, and that actually came after Tom Allen's radio show when a fan approached him and was basically like, you're a really nice guy, but you need to make a business decision, and was basically telling him to fire Walt Bell, and then that happened in that game, so that's pretty wild. And then ultimately Allen did let him go. I guess what else do you think we can expect from the Indiana offense? That maybe is going to be new.
Well, first I'll just say let's talk about their offensive line, because they have some of the same guys they had 2 years ago and last year, but they are a lot better. And so they brought in a very experienced offensive line coach, Bob Bostad, I think it is.
Oh, yeah.
If I'm remembering right. And so they've actually been able to play their best lineman at guard to protect him. I think it's Bedford. So he is kind of like in your Reggie Sutton situation. He's had a ton of injuries, nothing as serious as Sutton, but they're able to protect him by playing him at guard, whereas they thought they were going to have to play him at tackle. But their other interior linemen, Kotick and Carpenter, are middle-tier Big Ten type guys. So you have to figure that they'll feel comfortable running the ball if they have any sort of lead, or just to try to, shrink the game down. But really the biggest thing for the Indiana offense is that they have some receivers. So they do like to feed Lucas as a receiver more than anything. Again, he's kind of Raheem Blackshear-ish. Think younger Raheem Blackshear when he was still kind of thin. I don't think his hands are as good, because even though he has a lot of receptions, he did kind of have one right in his hands that hit both of his 2 hands, and then he got picked off the other game. And then at least one other one that hit him in the hand and was intercepted. So that's one of the reasons that they prefer to use him as a runner sometimes, even though when he's in the backfield, he doesn't have as much success, because his vision is much better in space, and he's got the speed to back it up. So I guess my biggest concern coming into the game is that Rutgers has a defense that you would probably look at most players and say almost every guy is average or maybe slightly above average speed for their position, but they don't really have anyone who's a burner like on their defense. I guess the closest might be a Max Melton, who played better last week in general. But if Lucas is breaking loose, I'm not sure who can catch him.
Yeah. Well, I think
the other thing is they have 2 very good receivers. They have McCauley, the former quarterback, who is, I think, ranked 15th in Pro Football Focus grades, and then Camper, who is in the top 5 or 6. So they have 2 starting caliber receivers, and then they also have another one, Omar Cooper, who people are high on, but I think he might have been a little bit hurt. So, and then they have DeKeese, I think I'm saying that right, Carter. So they're kind of like Rutgers. They kind of use 4 receivers that are all capable, that if you don't account for them, they can beat you. So I think they're going to look to feed these guys balls. Like Jackson might throw it into traffic, or Sorsby won't throw it into traffic, but Rutgers should have time to react. But really, the bread and butter of their offense is feeding these big receivers and trying to use them as possession receivers to matriculate the ball down the field.
Yeah, so I did an episode earlier on the secondary and how sure tacklers they've been for Rutgers this year. Flip Dixon has one missed tackle all year. Longerbeam has two. Rutgers right now, Pro Football Focus, the number one tackling team in the country in terms of highest grade of tackling efficiency, which is pretty wild. And I think that's been a big part why they've been able to prevent big plays and be able to, stop in the intermediate area in terms of not letting guys run loose. So Lucas is going to be a tough matchup for sure. Going back to Bosted, so he was a longtime offensive line coach at Wisconsin, 2 different stints, but in between was hired by an NFL coach at Tampa Bay named Greg Schiano in 2012, 2013 as the offensive line coach. So they have some history there. So that's I honestly didn't even know that until you mentioned the name.
Well, I think Schiano mentioned it in the press conference, at his press conference on Monday. I kind of half picked it up. He was like, he was my offensive line coach in Tampa, but I didn't hear. I should have put 2 and 2 together. I didn't think of that.
Yeah. I read through it. I went through the press conference. I picked out kind of what I wanted to use, so I didn't focus on it too much. But yeah, I knew it was familiar when you said it. So that's an interesting wrinkle for sure. So in terms of the Indiana defense, they started out the season pretty strong. They, it was the first game, but Kyle McCord, at starter Ohio State, they limited him. I think it was low 20s. Louisville, I thought they played him pretty tough. They only lost by 1 score. I think they held them to 21. So the defense was pretty good, and then they've struggled recently. Obviously got their doors blown off against Michigan. What do you think the key is there with the Indiana defense?
You got to tire them out. They lack depth. So, I mean, this comparison, if I didn't already mention it, when you watch them, they really remind you of a 2017 or 2018 Rutgers squad on both sides of the ball, really. So on the defensive side, Aaron Casey, who is he plays every linebacker spot, basically. He reminds me a lot of Deontay Roberts. He's a sure tackler. He's, usually in the right place at the right time. Reeds plays well. This isn't a situation like we have with Virginia Tech where guys are running around not knowing what they're doing. He is a guy who knows how to play, knows how to help organize the other guys in his area. But, a guy like that, if he loses half a step because he's tired, that can make a big difference. Their most depth is probably on their defensive line, but they've only got one guy who's really been making a difference as a pass rusher. That's Andre Carter. Opponents have been able to focus on him. So I think that once he started getting double teamed more, he started getting held more too and not being called. But he has been stuffed a little bit with that. So it'll be interesting to see how Rutgers lines up with him. They play they kind of play a 3-4/4-3. They have a position they call the bull, which is kind of like a hybrid end linebacker role. And so it'll be interesting to see where that pressure comes from. But I think that their pass rush has really, really struggled, especially with Carter. So what they've had to do is they've had to bring linebackers or blitzing safeties and trying to kind of use speed off the edge, which then also makes them vulnerable to runs either by the quarterback, which Akron killed them with the quarterback run, or even just quarterback buying time, stepping up in the pocket because there's this vacated space as a guy's like running around the outside. So they've had to come up with compensating controls basically, and as a result, they've gotten burned by it. In terms of linebacker and secondary, like you mentioned, they have 2 pretty good safeties and one, very good linebacker, but there's not a lot of depth. And I think the biggest weakness that they have is just lack of kind of top end speed on their defense too. And so you've seen a lot of plays where if a coverage is not even busted, but if anyone's late to their assignment or if somebody breaks one tackle, they do have trouble like squaring them up. It's almost like sometimes when you watch the Maryland game, it was almost like they were in a kickoff coverage where everyone was kind of in a lane, and if one guy missed a tackle or one person wasn't in a proper place and a back or a receiver broke through, there was no one else to get him. That's kind of what it felt like. And I know Maryland's offense is a little more explosive than Rutgers in a variety of ways, but that's kind of like what it felt like. If one guy missed his assignment, then they were in trouble. So the more tired they get, the better chances you have of maybe a guy not being in the right position or something like that. But when they're well rested, like they were in the second half against Louisville, they're not a bad defense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was curious whether the physicality of the Big Ten has kind of worn them down now that we're midway. Obviously, they had their bye 2 weeks ago, but from a Rutgers perspective, obviously coming off a huge emotional high, knowing what's on the line in this game for them, what do you expect from them, and what do you think some of the keys to victory are for them?
Well, I think one is, like we said, with Rutgers coming off the Michigan State game, is that teams are going to try to send speed rushers off the edge, especially on Reggie Sutton's side.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in the Michigan State game late, and people are like, how is Monangai popping all these runs? Basically, what they were doing was the only way they could get a pass rush was sending extra blitzers off the Rutgers right side. And so, especially when Kobe Asamoah was in there, I'm not sure if it was a communication thing, but there were several times where it seemed like he wasn't blocking anybody. Reggie Sutton was blocking a guy, and then there was still somebody else coming around the outside. So was Asamoah supposed to be blocking him? I don't know, because when Curtis Dunlap was then in the game, Rutgers was running the ball more than they were passing it, but they were able to kind of build a wall on that right side, and that's where Michigan State was sending extra people. So then Kyle Monangai tended to just kept running to the opposite side where there was less defenders, and they were having tons of success. I mean, how many of those big runs that Monangai popped were to the right? It was all middle or left, pretty much.
Yeah, and very zigzaggy too.
What?
Zigzaggy, like he would start on the right and he'd go through the middle and end up on the left.
Right. I don't know if there's just more people there or that was the play design. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
But Michigan State started that in the first half, and they had success where Wimsatt was doing the right thing in terms of he was looking to that side, assuming that, okay, if pressure's coming here, that must be blitzers. That means there's space in one-on-one matchups. But he had, by my count, 2, maybe 3 passes batted down that were all in that direction, where he was trying to throw to where he thought there was vacated space, but they got knocked down. Actually, and then he had one that might have just been a wet ball. That's why I'm saying it was 2 or 3. I'm not 100% certain. But Rutgers adjusted, and then Dunlap and Sutton did a much better job on that side. And then that's also helps your run blocking because Dunlap on the right side, good run blocker. And with Felter and Pierce holding up on the other end, I mean, the Rutgers had a lot of success. So I do think that they will be wary of that. I'm sure Indiana will try it. Like I said, they've gotten success with their pass rush when they send a speed rusher off the side, especially Rutgers' right side, their left. So I do expect that there might be some of that. But, Gavin Wimsatt he fired passes into tight windows, especially to Christian Dremel. He had that one that I thought was Langen because it normally where Langen would be, but it was actually Dremel, like where he kind of snuck in between 2 defenders. We had the play that should have been probably targeting. There was a couple plays like that were key where he threw the ball into tight windows, and those windows should be available against Indiana as well. I do think that they have a little bit more versatility in terms of playing press man or zone. I think that their defense is, even though they lost the athletes from their elite defense 2 years ago, they still, know what they're doing. So I do think you're going to have to just beat them and with the pass, but I do think there should be some running lanes if Rutgers gets the looks that we think Indiana's going to show them up front. That's what I would say is the biggest takeaway from the Rutgers offense. The other thing was we didn't see Jaquay Jackson a lot in the last game. Perhaps they were riding the hot hand. We hadn't heard anything about an injury, but he's the type of guy where, he's got the athleticism that I think if he gets in space, he might be able to run away from some of the Indiana defenders and not be caught. So a guy like him, Ian Strong, I'm not sure about his top end speed, right? But he might be able to box some people out and get catches. But I do think that the way to beat this defense for Indiana is you got to get the ball in the hands of your playmakers, especially your speedier ones, and you might have a lot of success.
So talking about the offensive line, with Sutton, obviously he's still trying to get some mobility back, working his way back, just his 3rd game. That was the first game that all 5 offensive linemen played 60-plus snaps, and it was that combination. It's funny how we've always kind of liked Felter and then obviously Sutton, but, neither of those guys were actually like in the reported mix in the preseason. So it's kind of funny how the offensive line rotation maybe has solidified now with 2 guys that you weren't even really counting on in August. But my question is, based on his mobility issues right now and the way that Michigan State did bring speed on the edge, Do you think that that's where maybe they'll compensate with maybe lining up a Langen or a Bowman on the right
Yeah.
of
Well, that
Sutton?
was the other thing that I was going to mention, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you like a couple days ago when I was watching it. One of the other things Rutgers did to help protect their guys on that side was not just line up a tight end on the right, which they did a few times with Bowman, and he whiffed at least on one block. But they started bringing guys in motion, or even using Christian Dremel to go in motion and get a block on somebody, because obviously he's not a big guy. But if you get him in motion and he's got a little bit more punch behind, his blocks, that seemed to work. So I think either Langen or receiver, we might see some motion there in addition to maybe even a tight end. Like maybe you keep a tight end on the right and you put someone in motion toward that side to give you a little bit of extra blocking prowess there. So I think that was an adjustment Rutgers made that worked quite well in the second half as against Michigan State. Uh, we saw in the first half, I was Aaron Young wanted to take a handoff, but he had to immediately abort it to block a guy coming off the other side. So it's possible that Michigan State will be copied there as well by Indiana in terms of trying to kind of rush those handoffs by Rutgers by bringing extra people. So, there's a lot of things you could do if you vacate it. Like if you do send too many people in motion, you know, it's possible. I mean, I think Indiana has got a smart defensive coaching staff, so I'm sure they're seeing even more than what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I feel like in this game too, especially with the way that even Sorsby last week had two fumbles, one was recovered, and then three turnovers by Jackson. How important is it for turnovers? I mean, the last time they were in Bloomington, they got 6 turnovers, and it was just a rout. I feel like this is the type of game where if Rutgers can get some early turnovers and get an early lead, it's going to play right into their hands and be able to just run it and wear Indiana out in the second half.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of going back to the Rutgers defense. One of the things that they did early in the game, because they kind of got steamrolled on the first drive, was
Right.
they actually dropped into more of a 3-3-5 defense. So they normally when we talk about Rutgers runs a 4-2-5, usually Aaron Lewis and Wesley Bailey are on the outsides, and then you have like a combination of Troy Rainey, Keontae Hamilton, Mayan Hanatu in 2 spots in the middle. But what they were actually doing was at times using Lewis or Bailey as a defensive tackle, and then Mo Toure was kind of in a hybrid linebacker edge rusher role with Jennings and Powell.
Right.
And Rutgers, once they went to that, Michigan State couldn't do anything. I mean, nothing. When you look at all the ways they moved the ball, there was like 3 pass interferences. Maybe one of them was a defensive holding, but they weren't moving the ball at all, really, other than some nice timing passes because Caton Hauser has a good arm. But all their big plays were penalties in the pass game. And so I think that was really confusing Michigan State a little bit. And I'm sure if Jackson's in the game, they will try to do the same thing. Because after Tyreen Powell's ejection, which he will be able to come back for the first half of this game, Rutgers then had to move Mo Toure back into a more traditional linebacker role. He was playing Powell's position, and Jennings was in his normal position. So then they tried to use maybe Jordan Thompson in that role a little bit. We saw him get an interception earlier in the year randomly, but he's really a traditional defensive end. So Rutgers kind of had to abandon that and go back to their regular 4-2-5, which let Michigan State a little bit more. They knew a little bit better what was coming in the game. So I expect Rutgers will try to confuse, especially Jackson if he's in there, or if they do see Sorsby, then they're going to probably try to press up a little bit and rely on their defensive backs because, to your point, Rutgers defensive backs have played well this year, and they're not going to, other than Lucas, Indiana relies on big receivers. So you feel confident that a Flip Dixon, who's not an elite speed guy, but is big, is going to be able to make some of those plays like we saw him do against a 6'7" Malik Carr last week. It's kind of the same concept. So I do think there's going to be opportunities for turnovers regardless of which quarterback's in there. And I think Rutgers will mix up their looks to try to kind of push the envelope and maybe force them in that way rather than just kind of sitting back. They might sit back in a cover 2 in terms of their safeties, but expect that there'll be a lot more happening up front to try to dictate the action.
Well, and the 3-3-5 is really intriguing. Also, you have to imagine that, as well as Toure is playing along with Powell and Jennings, it makes sense too, kind of the rest of this year, to work that in with having all three of those guys in at the same time. And it also, I think, helps keep the defensive line a little fresher, and Toure can be that hybrid role where even he could be in the 3-3-5, and then, all of a sudden he lines up on the edge and then they give a different look. So I think that makes that really intriguing in terms of what maybe it can bring to the defense, a different element they haven't had yet.
Right. And I mean, I guess one of the big takeaways, though, from the other side of the coin is that they didn't feel confident enough putting Moses Walker in one of those two spots. He was playing on special teams, so he wasn't hurt. So that kind of leads you to believe that this is what they want to do, but maybe they just trust these linebackers so much that as other guys build trust with the coaching staff, that it will be another thing we see next year or maybe even back half of this season.
Yeah.
Even if Powell or Jennings has to come off the field.
True. Yeah. I think it's less of a Moses Walker thing and more of you just got to have Mo Toure on the field as much as humanly possible.
That helps.
He's just been phenomenal coming back from injury. Arguably, I mean, and it's amazing. Like looking at the defense, right? I mean, there's so many players that have a legitimate argument to be defensive MVP between Lewis, Toure, Dixon. I mean, those guys are all having, and Lewis didn't have his
longer
best
beam game. Even. Yeah.
Longer Beam's had a great year for sure. I mean, all these guys are. There's no weak links anywhere on the defense, and it's definitely one of the best defenses in a long time. I said earlier this week, I think depth is everything right now in terms of obviously they have to stay healthy. We've talked previously. Any concerns or maybe less concerns now with the emotional high of Michigan State, them going to Indiana, knowing if they can just win this game, they'll achieve their goal of going to a bowl game versus the idea that this is their 8th game in a row without a bye. This is the 3rd week in a row they're playing a team that's relatively well rested. And we know what happened 2 years ago. Obviously not the same team, but when they went to Northwestern, they were kind of a dead team walking in terms of their physicality, not showing up in that game. Any concerns in this one?
Well, when we talk about the quote pipeline, that usually means you have seniors who, let's say you've been to a bowl game, which they have, but those guys might not have played a lot, or this is they want to put their stamp on it. And having seniors as some of your leaders really goes a long way to prevent some of those emotional letdowns, prevent that overconfidence to some extent. Indiana's offensive line is so much better than they were 2 years ago that Rutgers isn't just going to blow up every play on the line of scrimmage and cause a blowout like that. That's not going to happen. But the thing that Rutgers has going for them that eases my concern somewhat is pretty much everyone around the Indiana program knows that they make mistakes and that they don't recover well from those mistakes, kind of like Michigan State, but probably with less talent. So maybe those plays will come in the first quarter. Maybe those plays will come in the second quarter. Even if those plays don't come until late in the second half, we have to feel confident that Indiana is going to start to, buckle a little bit and Rutgers is going to go for the kill. So, yeah, that said, yes, I'm more confident, but I do still think that, ESPN FBI, which is getting a lot better at its predictions, I'd say 2/3, maybe 70% chance Rutgers wins this game because Indiana has some talent. They've got a lot of transfers. This is pretty much two teams with equal talent overall. Now, I think that is a slight fallacy, though, because I think Rutgers has a little bit more talent at the premium positions. When you talk about like edge rusher, cornerback, quarterback Wimsatt has played a lot better. He's kind of been Sorsby and Jackson both together as one person this year. When you talk about how he hasn't really turned the ball over, but he's also willing to run, but he also has a pretty big arm. So clearly there's a scenario where Rutgers loses this game. Indiana is a legit Big Ten team. They are not as bad as some of the bad Rutgers and Indiana teams we've seen in the past. But if Rutgers just plays average, they should win. So how do you prevent that emotional low? Well, you got to be buttoned up on special teams. Indiana's kind of like Michigan State. They're a little bit boom or bust. Obviously, they got Lucas, who's a great kickoff returner. We saw, I think it was him who burned Rutgers last year. Was it the very opening kickoff of the game?
I think it was, yeah. I think it was the first kickoff.
And he had a huge one against Maryland. They've had some terrible plays in the punt game where Maryland got short fields. So as long as you don't get beaten on special teams, I think you're going to win the other two facets of the game.
Last thing for me to ask is a potential wild card. We were talking about it before coming on. There is a perhaps slight possibility that Dexter Williams, who started the last 2 games of last season and then tore his ACL in the season finale, Tom Allen had said he was available for emergency purposes last week. He's hinted at, or he said flat out, whoever starts this week is going to be the starter for the rest of the season. Do you think there's any chance that, he's kind of disguising this and all of a sudden Dexter Williams is going to be out there to start the game?
It's entirely possible. I don't think it's likely, but it could happen.
Does it change much?
I don't think it changes that much because Williams does not have a lot of experience.
Right.
So kind of like we saw with Hauser last week is because of that lack of experience, there's going to be things he hasn't seen that you can throw at him in coverage and also he's coming off of an injury. So even if he's coming off I think ACL injury, you said, right?
Yeah, torn ACL.
It's unlikely that his mobility is 100% either. So I don't think that in your back pocket, or even if they decided to go with the true freshman who was a high 3-star, grabbing his name, Brock Lowry, who some fans are starting to clamor for, it's possible. I mean, Indiana's one of the big questions with them is how desperate are they? And the general consensus is that they think they can beat Rutgers with what they have right now. But if they lose this game, that's when we might see a major change. But then to your point, the coach insists that whoever starts this week is the starter this rest of the way to avoid, a guy looking over his shoulder every time he makes a bad play. So, I mean, I don't think it changes a lot, but yeah, I would say if you were to tell me an unexpected quarterback led Indiana to victory, I would say, oh, did Dexter Williams play? That would be my go-to question. So it's possible, but again, he only threw 38 passes last year, and he completed 13 of them. So even though he flashed behind an abysmal offensive line, it would be a big jump to expect him to lead them to a victory.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting because I actually think that Allen's saying he's going to stick with whatever quarterback he chooses. He's obviously on the hot seat right now. And I think that is a way for him to say, we're investing in this quarterback. We're developing him for next season to try to, I'm not saying it will work, but maybe buy some time and hoping that he gets another year with whoever he anoints. And that's why it wouldn't shock me of those 4 guys. I mean, I feel like he could pick any of them. Maybe even the true freshman, and this is no disrespect to Rutgers, but it's like, if you're not going to do it at home at the end of October, against Rutgers, when are you going to make when are you going to give, there's not going to be probably much better of a situation to work somebody in. There is no good situation in the Big Ten, and Rutgers certainly has a very, very good defense, but there's not really a better time for them to do it, especially they still have 6 games left in the season. So it's a natural kind of break point for them to make a move.
Yeah, well, the other thing to keep in mind is you could say they're dead in the water, but if Indiana wins this game, their last 3 games are Illinois, Michigan State, and Purdue. So I don't think they're as good as Michigan State, but they're going to think they can win all 3 of those games. Then they got Wisconsin the week before, who's on their backup quarterback. So
yeah, true.
Yeah, they've got to play Penn State, but much like we talk about, they've already got Ohio State and Michigan out of the way. So
yeah, so Rutgers is probably the 3rd hardest game left on their schedule then.
Probably. Might even be harder than Wisconsin, depending on how Wisconsin's backup plays. He only played a little bit. We don't know.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, it's possible that they would ride it one more week. But to your point, they said they're not. They got to look at this, that they have basically, I guess it's 4 chances to win 3, maybe 5 chances to win 4, because there's no way they're beating Penn State.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I honestly have no idea who they'll go with. The best guess is they'll go with Sorsby because he's not turning it over, and they think if they play clean football, they can win this game. That's the most likely scenario.
He's also more versatile in that he is a dual threat, so that makes it a little harder on the defense also.
Yeah, and they have big receivers, right? So like we saw with Rashino in the 2016 season when they had Andre Patton, it's like if you just throw the ball up to this guy, he'll get it. Like it's kind of like that receiver Camper, right? Like he's huge. I mean, McCulley's actually bigger, but Camper's probably he's more of like a jumping like type of athletic receiver like Patton. So you kind of figure like if we can just get plays that this guy can execute, it could work. Whereas Jackson, I mean, the sad part is for Indiana fans, the one time he tried to run, he got stopped at the 1-inch line against Louisville, and they ended up losing. Like,
Oh,
that's
that's the
the brutal
Friday Night
part.
Lights moment.
Yeah. Down 21-14. It was third or fourth and goal, and then he stretched out for the pylon, and he was just short. And it's like their season could be totally different because then they would have been tied with all the momentum and a crowd that, from my understanding, was very pro-Indiana before they kind of became apathetic later in the year. So,
last closing thoughts on your end.
again, I think this is a 60, maybe 70% chance Rutgers wins. This is by far their best chance the rest of the way. They have to look at it as it's their last, even if it's not. Like, they do have to treat this as what some commentators put as Rutgers and Indiana are both playing their national semifinal this week. Like, because, in terms of whoever wins this game is going to have a shot at bowl eligibility, and whoever doesn't, it's going to be much, much tougher. So both teams could come out firing, like they should.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's what I was hoping maybe the end of the Michigan State game would teach them, is that they just need to go out guns a-blazing in this game and let it all hang out because, yes, I completely agree with you. I don't think – I kind of believe Shiano. I think they do try to, emphasize every game the same, but you're right. I mean, the players have to know in the back of their heads, especially just the way the situation's set up. You would go into a bye week. You're going to a bowl. You have 2 weeks to get healthy for a monster matchup against Ohio State. National perception would be at an all-time high, at least since Shiano's returned. It would be hyped up. It would just put the program in a tremendous light for 2 weeks. There's so much good vibes that could come from this. They have to have some – they're human, right? They know that that's out there. So I have to think that is a motivating factor for them. But I know there's probably Rutgers fans listening to this and cringing and waiting for the other shoe to drop and saying that's the perfect time for this to fall apart. But we'll see. I think that, it could go either way, obviously, but I'm kind of confident that I think there's the leadership strong enough on this team that they're gonna start this game pretty strong and be pretty hungry to end it early.
I think that the Ohio State game being in 2 weeks helps because I think if it was next week, then you might start looking a little bit ahead, but I don't even think that game is in their minds. It's barely in my mind. I'm not even a player.
I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that what it could do for the program as a whole,
right?
If they win, but I think it's more of nobody wants to go into a bye week losing, and the fact that not only would they win the game going into a bye week, but their top goal essentially would already be achieved. So. It almost allows them time to kind of celebrate and then, okay, now what's the next goal? And then have a whole reset in their mindset in terms of what they can potentially do in November, which we know is a brutal schedule. But still, it's just it's very rare in a season where you have that kind of logical break and you can have that mental reset, in a way that makes sense. And this presents a perfect opportunity to do that.
All you got to do is just show that Northwestern game to them from 2 years ago on Friday night and be like, don't do that.
David Anderson, a pleasure as always. Thanks so much. A doubleheader this week. Appreciate you being here and look forward to talking to you again next week. And thanks so much for listening to Scarlet Faithful once again.